maybe we should get started here with Jim, who is going to introduce us to advanced content moderation in Drupal. Jim, joining us from Four Kitchen, I believe, in Pennsylvania, you told me earlier. Welcome and take it away.
All right, well, thank you so much for letting me be a part of your event. And let me share my screen. I hate to turn that off because I love seeing everyone's faces. And in the spirit of collaboration, feel free to ask questions in the chat, assuming that tool is open. I will do my best to answer them in real time. I have a lot of content on this topic and will gladly personalize it to the folks in this room. If there's a problem you're stuck on, if you're working on something that's fairly advanced now, or if you're just getting started, I'll try to make sure to hit those pieces. So if you'd like to take a moment and mention why you're interested in this session, by all means, I will make sure to address that as time goes, but no pressure. Let me share my screen and hopefully everyone will see my slides, advanced content moderation in Drupal. I'm getting a thumbs up. Fantastic. So we're here to talk about editorial workflows, really. And that's adding collaborative tools that move content through our CMSs. Out of the box, Drupal's workflow is fairly flat. Things are either published or they aren't. And with some popular modules and maybe some custom code, we can build something that better matches the roles and processes used by our organizations. So I'm going to present this in 3 sections. I'm going to start by talking about editorial processes in general used by digital marketers. Next, we'll look at how we map those processes to states and transitions in Drupal. And then we'll review some popular modules for extending your workflow and maybe some custom code. I hope you leave this session feeling empowered to use the Drupal moderation tools in your next web project, but also learn some of the challenges, costs, and risks in setting these up, as they are very involved features. To introduce myself, I'm a senior engineer at Four Kitchens, and I've been in Drupal for over 10 years. I use the framework for all of my nerdy hobbies, from running calculations for brewing beer to planning retro arcade projects and teaching kids how to prepare for a zombie apocalypse at Philadelphia area summer camps. If you have any questions about this presentation, please reach out. I'm always excited to talk shop, and I'd love to keep the chat going. At Four Kitchens, we build websites and apps for organizations that depend on large scale or unconventional content. So we work a lot with associations and publishers in higher education, in media, and enterprise organizations, and we make really big websites. So process documentation. Building your workflow starts with good documentation, a good understanding of how your team works. And this should reflect the people, the tools, the events, all of your systems of accountability for how ideas become something of a reality. And I know that's abstract. How does an idea become real? For me, I guess we all have a creative process internally. I'm a list person. I like to list out new ideas for my side projects or create a checklist of routine tasks or a to-do list. I will write something on a to-do list just to cross it off later when it's done, even if it's after the fact, just because it makes me feel good. That's my process. That's not true of all my friends. Some are pioneers that are spontaneous and decisive. Others are more integrators. They want consensus around what they're working on. Our working styles are very personal, and sometimes they can conflict. And I think it's one of the reasons the idea of a group project scares so many of us. Please keep this in mind when we're talking about building a workflow. I always like to start by interviewing the folks who I'm building this for, because without their insight, I'm going to create something that's biased on my own creative processes. And it's a big responsibility when you're building software that dictates how someone else needs to work. Creating interfaces that are too rigid, they don't allow collaboration, and they'll stifle good ideas or even impose an unwanted layer of governance. So make sure you're building things that are inclusive and empowering to your users. And to get started, let's look at some users. So this is a real organization, as told in icons, from higher education. And they're a former client of mine. They're a marketing and communications team at a large university. Hundreds of folks act as content contributors from different parts of the university, and this organization moves the content into the university's digital spaces. So for this example, our contributor is someone who works at a nature center, and they have a bunch of events, outdoor events, and they're holding a competition for birding. And they have this idea. They work with a strategist to get their content into the digital space. The strategist oversees a portfolio of campaigns, and they have access to all the rest of the web development teams. A copywriter and a creative member are going to write the copy, generate content that's in the right brand and the right voice, and maybe generate photographs or go through the digital asset management system and find the right assets for this push. And they decide for this event, this bird watching event, as part of their spring festivities. They're going to make a web page and an event page for folks to register. So we tag in the next team, our sort of next level down in digital production. The CMS team member, this is the person working in the Drupal site. And the editor is somebody who's reviewing the content for brand consistency, language, voice and tone, things of that nature. We also need, once this content's live, a social media campaign and a email campaign from the CRM team. These are engaging people as the event leads up, maybe reaching out to a list of folks that the Nature Center has on their contact list, folks who have signed up for email. It's a lot of folks. And while this is extremely collaborative, each member works in their own space with their own technologies. So the strategist is using Office 365 and the other strategists, they all maintain a Trello board to act as their content calendar. The copywriter uses Gather Content because it's very collaborative to figure out what story they're writing. And the creative services person uses Widen for their digital asset management system, keeping track of all their current assets and different cuts and how they distribute those to their digital channels. The CRM team and the editor are in Drupal, although some of this content is going into Eventbrite. And the CRM team is communicating through, or the CMS team is communicating through Jira. Social media uses Hootsuite to manage their channels, and the CRM team is using Salesforce. So there's a lot going on in unique silos, and to make it even more noisy, all these folks communicate in different ways, whether it's Zoom or Office 365 emails, Outlook, Slack, Microsoft Teams. Also, don't dismiss the idea of chocolate chip cookies. It is a great way to get your tickets to the top of the priority list in Jira. So chocolate chip cookies, definitely a communication mechanism. With all this noise, it gets overwhelming. And I'm sure everyone can relate to this madness. So let's take a step back. We've all used these cloud tools. Sometimes it feels like the technology Thunderdome, constant churning over. What can we do to, I don't know, rein in some sanity? Maybe. Well, let's look at how content originally gets to this team. We can create an intake form in Drupal where folks with elevated permissions could pitch ideas, much like in a newsroom. The strategist can look at that in a dashboard, maybe ask for feedback, ask follow-up questions, or even assign it to the copywriter and creative services member. The copywriter can have fields that match with the work they would have done in Gather Content. And Drupal can certainly be a digital asset management system. I've built those sites. Even the social media team and the email team can do a lot of their functionality within Drupal, gathering copy, pushing it out, using maybe a Drupal mail handler to send emails on a campaign cycle tied to the dates that the strategist puts in, very automated. All of this is possible, and it's a horrible idea, at least to do all of it. This is expensive. It would take hundreds of development hours just to produce a rudimentary DAM or CRM or social media integrations to all the platforms. So instead, one option is to look at APIs. Gather Content, for instance, has a great API where the copywriter can pull in, he gets synced into Drupal. Or instead of creating our own in-house DAM, we could integrate with Widen or Salesforce to send emails. We certainly don't want to overdo it because this could be very expensive. And if these systems change and when they change, social media, for instance, maybe we de-emphasize Pinterest, but now we've added on TikTok. Well, all that work we've invested into the API is kind of fallen since we're supporting it in-house. So expense is certainly one of the reasons we can't put everything in Drupal. And the second is we can't upend external processes. The CRM team is going to keep using Jira, and the strategists are going to keep using Trello because they use it for things outside of this web content workflow. But maybe we can create dashboards for them or other features that can bring them into the fold without trying to upend their processes. So let's talk about workflow features, Act 2. Building your workflow in Drupal is more of a choose your own adventure. And my recommendation is to start small and grow that tool set based on your team's feedback. For most sites, your end users aren't going to see the content moderation tools. So it's very hard to get the budget to invest a lot of time in something if it's not impacting a lot of your major business goals, or at least that are front facing. I told you I'm a list person. And when I was planning this talk, I started to make a list of everything that I thought of as editorial workflow. And here's kind of a visualization of that. So it's access and collaboration, content moderation, communications, and many small topics in between. I don't have time to cover all of them. If there's anything in particular you're interested in, feel free to drop a link in the chat. I'm having a hard time figuring out how to keep the Zoom tools up at the same time, but I will do my best to answer questions definitely by the end of this presentation. What I will look at for sure is in the content moderation space, I want to talk state management and transitions, along with some of the other pieces of just getting content moving through the system. On collaboration, we should talk about dashboards and revisioning, because I feel like as soon as you add a workflow, you need a way for folks to be able to identify and manage what's inside, what's sitting stagnant, what needs your attention. And then access and communications, I probably just want to discuss, but if you have any additional questions, let me know. I'll have a module roundup with a slide. So if you hear me listing off modules, I do have a slide with links to all of them and a way to share these notes with you. All right, I said I'd start with content moderation. This is how I get started when I'm planning a workflow. And this is a very traditional publication workflow. An idea comes in, and it goes to its first state. In these diagrams, a state is a label I would put on content to say what point of the workflow is it in. So the state can be draft, in review, published, or archived. The states are my boxes. The arrows represent transitions, either to itself, we can take a draft, make a change and save it and keep it as a draft, or to another state. So the transition can be send for review, the transition can be publish, or the transition can be archive. This is maybe the workflow for an event, something that is going to be spun up and moved up to production. It goes through some sort of quality review cycle, and the editor can either approve it and publish it or reject the changes and send it back to draft. And the original content owner can continue to work on this content. I'm also using this globe icon to say when the content is live. So we see that the draft and review are not live to the world, but once it goes through the publish transition, it is now live. This is the default revision, and it will remain live on the site until, for some reason, maybe as part of a content cleanup effort, we start archiving out-of-date content. This was the easiest example, and probably something you've worked with in one of your systems before. A lot of CMSs have a workflow similar to like this out of the box. Drupal kind of does. Let's get a little more advanced. This is the same workflow, but shown as part of a revisioning workflow. So we start with that content. Imagine we just continuing this diagram to the right. Published content will stay published even as we're working on changes. When someone clicks edit, a contributor clicks edit, maybe that strategist is working on the content directly, and they make some changes on behalf of their content contributor. There were some descriptions of the property, parking information for the event date that needs to change. So they make their changes in draft state, and when their content's ready, they click the button for send to review. The transition takes it to send for review. And from this space, the editor can either request new changes, sending it back to a draft, or publish it. What's interesting about this revisional workflow is when something new gets to published, it becomes the live state, and then the previously published version becomes archived. So I don't know, it's a bit of a challenge the first time you work in one of these workflows to recognize that there are two versions, at least two versions of your copy at any given time, the live version and then the most recent version. But I said this was advanced workflows. So let's look at a couple examples, first on paper and then in Drupal. The first one is states and transitions for a job application workflow. I told you I run summer camps in the Philadelphia area, and this is my workflow. I have a state for when someone submits an application. And while I don't have permissions on this diagram, I open this up to anybody. Anonymous users can submit a node. They can't view them, but they can submit them. And from there, someone on our team gets a notification over an email, and we have 3 transitions we can make. We can, at any given stage, reject it. Might be spam, or the person is just grossly unqualified. We could save it for a future prospect. Maybe they look very promising, but we've already hired everyone we need in that region. So we want to keep their resume on file, and we thank them for applying. And the third is we offer them an interview. So that's our third transition. From the requested interview state, we have 3 options again: the reject, send to future, or offer them a job. So if we've had an interview with them and we want them to be a member of the team, we send them an offer letter, and now the offer has been sent. And from here, they may reject us, or they may have already accepted another job and they would have loved to work for us. So we'll keep you on file. Or finally, let's say they accept the job and they're hired. One thing I added to this diagram is the publish date. Outside of the initial intake form, our anonymous users should not be able to see any of this content, once it exists in Drupal. And so all of this content in the workflow is unpublished. There are no lines that go to the publish date. There are no transitions. So there's no way this is going to leak out to the world. And personally, I put in a couple other cases just to make sure that even if it was published, folks couldn't see it because it is sensitive data. And my last example here before we jump into things on the Drupal side, make it a little more real, is a workflow for a help desk ticketing system. So in this example, you see quite a few boxes, but I originally drew it much bigger. If you've ever worked in a help desk or use a system like Jira, you may had to request help on something, and it could be a variety of things. Something's broken, that's issue management. And so that's this first branch coming up to the right. Something's broken. Or we have a new team member and they need access to these 3 websites or tools. That's requesting access. And there could be other ones too. I want to reserve some hardware from the help desk, or I need training on new software, or I need, I've been locked out of a purchasing system and we need an administrator to click a button. So they can be routine tasks and they could be very different teams. The team in charge of hardware might not be the same one who's in charge of account access management, might not be the same team who's debugging code. So in this workflow, the very first state anyone can submit to who's an authenticated user. Let's go back to our university example. Anyone at the university who's logged in through single sign-on, create a new ticket. They can edit content on this add form, so they can add content. But once it's submitted, they can no longer edit their ticket. They can only leave comments. The new ticket comes in and it goes into this new ticket state, and somebody in charge of expediting tickets for the help desk decides which sub-team do I send this to? I only have 2 of them illustrated here. So this is something's broken on the website, send it to issue intake, or, oh, they need account access. This is super procedural, send it to that team. They have processes for granting or removing access. From here, these tickets appear in a dashboard and based on your own team. I have built one of these before and we actually added the permissions in so that you had to be a member of that team to edit that content. If you'd like to hear more about that, let me know. From the issue intake, this is where something's broken on the site. It can be assigned to a person. So this is just the team's general bucket. It's assigned to me, to Jim. Jim's going to figure it out. I don't have all the details. The original person's not there. I have to put the issue on hold. When I get my questions answered, I bring it back into the fold. I transition it back to changes required, and I continue to work on that bug, work on that bug. Let's assume I can't reproduce the bug no matter how hard I try. Unfortunately, that happens all too often. I don't want to delete the ticket. Instead, I'm going to close it. It's unresolved, but it's closed. And that's important because if we see the bug happen several times and we can never reproduce it, well, at least now we're getting some forensic data and documenting every issue. It becomes an issue of problem management then. Or maybe I have a fix and I want to take that issue and I send it to the client approval. So the original person who said page X, Y, and Z are broken, I come up with a fix and I say, check out these links. Do they work now? Something else not on this workflow, but I think would be a nice feature is the ability to automatically schedule transitions. So maybe after I've transitioned from me working on it to asking the original client, is this thing fixed? I put a 72-hour counter on where it automatically resolves if they don't respond, or a week, or whatever that might be. So that's very possible using Drupal contrib modules. And then the issue is resolved. It can be reopened, make a couple of tweaks, but really should be closed again. If there's a new issue, submit a new ticket. The request access intake is much shorter. Someone needs access to site X, Y, and Z. They're given access, and then the ticket is resolved. Once again, none of these can be published. This is all proprietary information. It shouldn't be public. These conversations are private. All right, that's plenty of slides. Let's get down to some Drupal because that's what we're here to talk about. I have a site here. It's on my local development environment, but if anyone is interested, all of the code, be it contrib modules or custom code, is publicly available on GitHub. It is my username, and I have a link to this at the end of my slides. So github.com/ngim/workflows, and you'll see any of my custom and contrib modules that I'm using in this project. For this project, let's first look at the example of a editorial, a publishing workflow. Ooh, I figured out how to get chat open. Thank you. I will have to bounce back to these questions later though. Let's look at an example of a content type called a post. This is a blog post. Add content post. And this is the admin user version of this. I'm seeing the form. It just has a title and a body. Nothing unique here. And it has a transition. So this is sort of out of the box Drupal content moderation. And I can see that new content can be either saved as a draft or moved right to in review. What is powering this? Let's take a peek. If you haven't been in here before, I'm using the Drupal module workflows. This is part of content moderation in Drupal core. There are some other competing projects, which I'll try to round up later. But in the workflows module, I have two workflows on this site. One of them is called this publishing workflow. In fact, it might be nice if I bring up the site. I'm not going to go too far into this since this is supposed to be an advanced content moderation. But if anyone hasn't seen this before, the boxes on this diagram, draft, in review, published, and archived, are our states. And you can see those are my states right here. Draft, published, in review, and archived. The transitions, let me edit this workflow. The transitions were things like send for review, publish, and archive, or request changes. And these are the transitions. And it really is as easy as adding a new state to add a new box, and we give it a name. If there was a state called on hold, I can add it here, click save, and it's set. And likewise with transitions, anytime I want to add a new transition, let's say, for instance, I need the ability to expedite something to go right from draft to published. And this is called, immediate publish. So that's adding a diagram or an arrow that goes from here to here. And it really is as easy as just saying where that goes from, where this goes to, and it's sort of drawing that digital line. So that is the basic Drupal content moderation using this workflows backbone to it. There are a few other settings that are important on the state, and this is where a lot of folks get hung up on their first time doing it. Oops, sorry, that was a transition. On the state called published, you'll see that I have two boxes checked, and actually cannot uncheck them at the moment. Published means that this thing, which happens to be called published, is published content. There might be multiple ways to reference published content. It might not always be called published. There's often times where things move through a very public-facing editorial process, and multiple states can be published. And default for vision also means that this is sort of the end of the content moderation cycle. So in the case of here, we're not going to keep making too many edits once things are published, but here there's a lot of cycling back and forth. So this is a default revision. Archived is also a default revision. If something goes to this state, it's not going there with the intent of moving forward anymore. And so that's what that button works with. It's just something I see folks get tripped up a lot. Another one that is a very common misstep is when creating your workflows, folks forget to add the ability to edit the existing piece. So going from draft to draft. And that might seem silly until the first time you try to edit your content and you realize that, that just by editing it, you're accidentally publishing it. So I always make sure to include a to draft from draft type of thing. That is that feedback loop. Back onto this form. Content. Let's think. Let me at least show off the content. So as content's created, and here are our posts, you're probably used to the Drupal content overview form. I absolutely hate this interface. I almost always create my own views, and I will show that in the next example. But here's an example of two posts. And just to show off some of the modules that I use regularly on a Drupal site, these are some blog posts I've written. You can find them on the Four Kitchens blog. Revisioning is something that's an important part of a lot of editorial processes. So when I make a change, what exactly was changed? And we can visualize that here. Let me create a new revision of this content, and I'm just going to remove a sentence. So not a trivial change. This is popping up just because I'm using some old versions of things. All right. So I've made a change. The sentences, a sentence was changed there. And since this is already published, I just absolutely just published it as is. But typically what would happen is a notification would get sent now to your editorial team, maybe one person or a list saying, hey, this content was updated with a link to the content. When the editor comes to this page, they might not know what changed, and we're going to ask them to reproof the entire thing. And so that's where the revisions interface can let us see a history of what's changed. By default, it's going to check the last two, and we're using the diff module to compare selected revisions. And so we get a red or green side-by-side description of what's changed, so someone could easily assess and approve this. I would say this is doing the bare minimum of what folks would expect from a content editorial process, and it doesn't do any more than that. So that is one of my big warnings. If you need highly collaborative content moderation, it probably should take place outside of Drupal. This won't be a solution for where you have multiple cursors interacting on the page at the same time, like a Google Docs. And if you're working on very complicated content models with nested paragraphs, for instance, or media items inside media items, it's difficult to notice what changed when it's maybe a reference to an entity and not the actual words on the page. So as you get into complicated data structures, this doesn't work, but it works very well for text, which ends up being a majority of my use cases for content moderation. So that's a very simple content moderation. One other thing that's on here, I have a slide picture of it later, is a content lock feature. So when somebody is editing, if someone else tries to edit at the same time, they will get a warning that this content is locked, and here's how you can break that lock. And the second is a auto save feature, which is one that saved me quite a bit. Someone's editing a page, they accidentally close out of all their tabs and leave for the day. And when they come back the next day, they realize, oh, geez, I was working on that content. It will prompt you and say, here's your most recent changes. Do you want to discard them? So I have a screenshot of that later in my slides too. But let's get a little more complicated, especially since the clock is ticking and I want to get to questions and stuff. The application workflow. So an application content type, let me open this up in incognito so we can pretend we're an anonymous user applying for a job at my summer camp. There it is, link, apply. And we fill out a name, Jim, and 555-1212, test@me.com. We fill out what we expected, a Drupal node form. It doesn't look too much like a node form. I'll skip some of these things. I am available for the retreat, but I do not want to work an overnight summer camp for this fictitious summer camp. And I'll also leave these fields blank. This is just a node form, although it might not look like one. One of the things I think is super important is to make your site not smell like Drupal, at least to public users. So by default, a node form is going to say something like create application. And that's confusing. It's not inconsistent with how you're using this form. So being able to relabel that, join our summer camp team, and there is a contrib module for that I have on a future slide. And being able to change the button. So the button doesn't just say save application or save node or whatever the default is. So submit a job application contextually makes more sense. And let me change this person's name to demo just so we can pick it out of a list later. I click submit. Sorry for this error. That's the workflow buttons module chattering on. And what you see is I should have had this redirect now that I think about it to a thank you page. That would be one thing I did. But what you don't see is the newly created content, because this user has the ability to add content, but not edit or even view their own application. That is private information. So we put a thank you message. We send an email that says, thank you for your submission. Here is how we are going to go through the job application process. And we send you to a thank you page. I should have set that up ahead of time. I think I have one, but I just didn't set it up. All right, back to the editorial view. We looked at what this workflow would look like with the different processes. This is a lot to manage, and this is a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks about dabbling in workflows. It's complicated because if someone submits an application, you have a responsibility to get back to them in a meaningful amount of time. So at the very least, we're talking about setting up notifications, probably for you and the person who applied. And then when you go to the site, you need a way to figure out, well, wait, which one was just submitted? Or what does the rest of my team think about this applicant? So that takes me to the topic of dashboards, which is something I build for all my content types anyways, but becomes even more important when talking about content moderation. So I have a manage applications dashboard, and it is just a simple twig template that is showing me how much content I have in each workflow state. And I'm embedding a view on this page, and this is the most recent submissions. So I can see these 2 submissions were submitted, and they haven't been reviewed in any meaningful way. And let me multitask here. Clear some caches and such, just so my demo is up to date. If I were to click submitted, I can see which ones are in that submitted state. That was the first box on the workflow. And something else I like to do is replace that content overview page with something more meaningful, because I don't care if it was sticky at the top of list, or even the submitted time isn't as important to me as who applied, what was their email so I can contact them, what position they apply for, and there were some other details. Can you work an overnight camp? Are you available for the staff training? Did you upload a resume? I'm just using Drupal views, and I'm replacing the fields with icons using a custom template. So I highly encourage you to find something that matches your workflow. I think about all the tasks that I need to take on with hiring people, and I've tried to put them into one place. And what I want to compare and contrast is, how do we move things between states? The default out of the box, I should have shown this. So here is our don't let a bare bones backend design. This is our blog post. Actually, let's just create a new blog post since we created a new application. Sample post. I should really work on some better demo copy. I will save this as a draft. This is a draft of the blog post we just created, and this is going to be Drupal's out-of-the-box workflow moderation tools. And what it shows you is the current state, so the current box you're on in the diagram, and the options of what are valid transitions to move this to. I can move this to in review. I can move this to published. I actually don't like Drupal's default content moderation tool. I think just listing the states is confusing. I would rather see the text offer an interview, or offer the position, or hire the applicant. I'd rather see what the line is, the transition, than just the states. So a couple of projects worth mentioning. There's workflow buttons, and that is the one that will turn this into a series of buttons rather than just a drop down with states. There's another one called workflow moderation sidebar. And what this does is it creates a little widget in the upper end of your administrative tools, and it shows you the different states you can move this to. I've really enjoyed this so much that I've recreated a lot of this functionality for myself, and I've added it to this view. And so we can see all the valid states for this new demo user. I can reject, save for next year, or offer an interview. If you're interested in seeing this code, please let me know. But it's as simple as loading the node, changing the state, and clicking save. So I would like to offer this person an interview. We should see them disappear from this panel, and we can see what else is available. And let's reject Alice. She answered the questions horribly. If I move back to my moderation tools, offer an interview, we see our demo content is here. Now we have contextually just the options available. So I appreciate either using that workflow sidebar tool, or the version that I kind of showed you there in views, which you have access to in my GitHub if you want my code, go nuts. So I really enjoy this. The language makes more sense to me as transitions. For the sake of time, I'm going to stop doing a demo of workflow, states, transitions, and dashboards, and just want to mention how important it is to put all those pieces together, because as you start bringing in new people into an editorial process, they're going to get confused, and they need a place to call home where they can see all of my common tasks in a spot. And I'm referring to that as a dashboard. But so there's time at the end. Let's look at some questions. First and foremost, danger. I'm acting pretty cavalier about this workflow, but by design, these mechanisms can really change how your team works. What you might find empowering could be frustrating or disenfranchising to other users. So please be prepared to budget for a large project if you try to add these kind of editorial tools to your projects. I have a university client that every 6 months we talk about adding a workflow, and every 6 months we kind of scare away from it because they have hundreds, if not thousands of people editing their site in a given year. And it means that now they'll have to invest in training, in more help desk staff, in higher quality documentation, maybe even a sandbox site for training their trainers. So it's a layer of infrastructure that they're just not prepared yet to go for. It's a big project. Also, as I kind of was driving home, as soon as you start adding features like states and transitions, you almost immediately need email notifications. That way content doesn't get lost in the process. Or you might need dashboards so you can locate the content, or diffing tools like the one I showed. Some of those are very easy to get set up, but they might not be your wildest dreams come true. Let's look at those modules I kept mentioning. One of them, pictured on the right there is moderation sidebar that I just showed off. And the one that was throwing the error constantly is workflow buttons. It's worth checking out, but the Drupal 9 one seems to have a typo in it. I'm going to probably try to fix that on Drupal.org. Another project I use regularly but didn't have time to work up a demo is the scheduler module. This is a very popular one where you can schedule content transitions. So in the help desk example, I said, well, once a ticket reaches the resolved state, let's automatically, or pending review state, let's automatically close the ticket if it hasn't been touched for 3 days. So you can schedule things. This is also very useful for large campaigns. If you have a blog post, an event, and a new page that all need to go live on the same day, such as a conference opening up. You can use the schedule module to schedule any of your transitions, published or unpublished, are the big use cases. And I also need to mention Workbench. Now, Workbench is something that's existed in Drupal's ecosystem for a long time. It is its own subset of modules, and it's fantastic. It is more opinionated than the things I had shown you. Out of the box, it does certain things very well, but because of its own layer of abstraction that it adds to your site, you might find it a little more limiting. You might not be able to add all of the bells and whistles without getting pretty deep into the code. So Workbench is a great alternative to building something from scratch because it's going to get you 90% of the way to that publishing workflow on day one. There's a series of modules, Workbench notifications. I think there's one just for a dashboard. So check it out. But this is probably your intro to workflows, and the things I'm showing you is the more baseline for a more extensive workflow. A couple more modules. Oops, click the link. Enhancing those forms. If you're surfacing content intake forms, node forms to other folks, you have to tame them. So I talked about the node override forms. That's the one where I changed the node form title, the node form button. You can also start changing messaging. So if someone says, do you want to delete this? You can put additional questions. I see an example here. All submitted applicants in the HR system should remain there. We can't delete an application unless it's just test copy. So I can override a lot of the defaults. So it's not just generic node references. It's about the content itself. So that's that one. Entity redirect is one I probably should have demoed. When you submit a job application, we should take you to a thank you page. So that's where entity redirect comes in. Auto entity label is very good for when people are generating content, and node titles is so often how we browse things, and we need a mechanism that labels them correctly. So I'll use this project often when I have user submitted content. And hide revision information. For better or worse, when you're using moderation, you're going to see revision blocks all over your node forms. This is the ability to hide those things from end users who shouldn't see them. So maybe I'll have my job application team has the ability to leave comments on an applicant. I had a 5-star rating mechanism and stuff like that, but I want to hide all of that from our external users. Revision management is another important one. I did mention most of these. So content locks, so 2 people don't edit at the same time. Diff was showing the red or green what changed on a page. Autosave, I had mentioned where, and here's an example of it on the right, this content was changed. Do you want to resume or discard those changes? And one I forgot to mention, node revision delete. There on especially your high valued pages, your home page, if you're tracking revisions for that, it might get updated thousands of times over the course of the life of your site. And you become a data hoarder when you have this workflow system turned on. So this is one of many projects. This is the most popular one for deleting past revisions that aren't really adding to your system anymore. You can clean that content out of the database because it can really pile up. I've mentioned notifications a lot. This is honestly its own topic, so I didn't even want to approach it. These are some modules I use regularly. The content admin notification is an out-of-the-box way to say new content has been created, send this list of users or this user an email. So thank you for applying for this job. And now the HR team gets an email, a new application has been received. This module is very easy for that. I'm also using comments on my job application site where our hiring team can leave comments about the applicant to each other. This extends that first one to allow emails to get sent on comment creation. If you're using Workbench as your Workbench email is a great solution. And finally, message and message stack. This is the much more end all be all beefy project. If you want folks to subscribe to notifications or have notifications sent at certain parts of your content lifecycle, maybe at a certain state, there's an editorial review board. And I just built this for a hospital network where clinicians and physicians have to review all changing documents. So that's what the messaging system does. It allows people to subscribe to more abstract events. Definitely worth checking out. I have to close this up because we are almost at time. So let me leave you with this. I want to encourage you to document your processes and interview the folks who are currently working on your team as content producers. Look for opportunities to elevate that content interaction and collaboration within Drupal and foster that collaboration, and try to build workflows that empower your site owners. Because there's a lot of great tools here and a lot of folks are in Drupal. If you can capture that momentum, it ends up being fairly magical. So I want to thank you. I do have a few minutes left for questions and I see some on the slides. I'll also pause here a minute before turning off the video so I can see faces. If you do want to reach out, I am NGym on pretty much anything social, including things like Drupal Slack or the High-Ed Drupal Slack. You can also find me on GitHub with this project with all my custom code. It's available that's powering the dashboard and the views feature that was showing content transitions. So please reach out and I'll work with the planning team here to put all of my slides or other resources on the website. So thank you so much. And let me stop the screen share and see if you have any questions. And I know I saw a few in the chat, so I can take them in order, but by all means, feel free to chat away. And let's see. Ralph asks, what was the issue labeling and making it accessible to a certain users? Was that issue labeling and making accessible to certain users accomplished with the groups module? Not in that case. So that was the idea of splitting content into multiple buckets and letting some users, I believe that's what it's referring to, letting the help desk people that are in charge of resolving issues see some of the tickets and letting the help desk team that was in charge of just account information see other tickets. I actually did that through, I forget what Drupal calls it. It's not access controls. There is an access control handler, but there's a more refined version of that. Although I've done it a lot through a Drupal, say a node access control handler, where you can, when content is loaded, run it through a set of CRUD options and say create, replace, update, delete. You could check each one of those. So you have access to the current user and you can see what team they're on, and you have access to the content and you can see what taxonomy term it's tagged with. And I just compared those two and I had a small array that mapped those things together. And by all means, feel free to ask your questions if you'd like. Thank you. Could this be used in a multilingual workflow? Yes, it totally can. And a good example, if you want to go to, is it Simple Test Me or Simply Test Me? You can spin up a Tugboat instance of the Unami demo, and that has a multilingual site with some light workflow tools on it. I see. I remember you mentioned using Workbench a couple of years ago, and we had to turn it off because the end users could not go to the dashboard to review what was assigned to them. And you don't believe there's an automated email notification system. I've had that feeling too in the past. I think the project has matured a lot in the last few years, but I also don't use it. I have found that I outgrow Workbench pretty quick. The Workbench emails project should send notifications, but it's very limited in what it can do. So I will often use that messaging stack module. It takes a lot longer to set up. It's a lot more responsibility, but you have fine control over all the interactions. To give an example of where it's blown my mind in the past, where I hurt myself in the past, is Let's say you want to send an email to the editor every time your content's ready for review. That was an easy thing to set up with one of these contrib modules. Content reaches this state, send an email to the editor. That's fine until you have an editor making changes to the content and it just keeps hitting the same state. And now every time an editor edits any page, it sends themselves an email. So we have to add some custom logic. That's frustrating, it's annoying, but it's also what you get out of a framework like Drupal, where you want the ability to really control your platform. It's going to take a little longer to set up. And one of the reasons I don't tread into content management lightly. All right. And just on behalf of Aaron here, I'll read it aloud. A few folks will be wrapping up the community room afterwards, so feel free to join at that link below. Any other questions?
I
Yes,
might
please.
have one. Just out of curiosity, one thing, just when you take a try at the workflow and content moderation modules, just the basic core functionality. One thing I never got I never understood really was the point for transitions. Why is it impossible for those two modules to access the functionality from the actions module? Because there's, for example, the email functionality included, and then you could easily assign it just via the user interface instead of a code intervention, let's put it that way.
It's been a few years since I've used actions, so unfortunately I don't have an answer to that question. What I've had to do in the past, in the recent past, is use something like an update, an entity update, or an entity add or create, I forget. There are two hooks for anytime content is created or updated. And so I've used that in the past to just check the moderation state. And so, entity, there's a method on there called moderation state. It's a magic method that will return the current state of the content. And I've used that as a way to trigger my custom code to run. So it really ends up being just a couple of lines of code in a hook. I know that's not the answer you want, but that's what you get out of a backend developer who shies away from the front end from time to time. What I also know for actions is it's adding another layer of complexity that not all modules are hooked into. And so there might be that with a little bit of work, someone could make it work and they just haven't yet. I don't have an answer, unfortunately.
Okay, I was just curious. Maybe there is some reasoning behind, but there isn't the possibility. And just one recommendation about a module I've found a few days ago. In that regard, I've posted in the chat. It's about notifications and email notifications, and it's quite flexible.
I am completely unfamiliar with this one. So this is the drupal.org/project/DANSE, Drupal Audit Notification Subscription Event. This sounds exciting. It sounds like a one-stop shop for what you were just addressing as a limitation.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you so much for letting me be a part of your camp. And it's been wonderful seeing all the other sessions. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Yes.
Thank you, Jim, for presenting. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Thank you, Jim, again. And have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.